We're gonna just go ahead and dive in. Today we're talking about Christian Science and about how this practice of Christianity helps us think about how to just feel and genuinely experience what the Bible tells us God's nature is and our relationship to God, um, to experience healing. Now, we're going to be talking about healing and about words like spirituality and God and prayer as we go along. These are big concepts and they mean different things to different people. Folks approach them in different ways, and that's fine. We'll define them as we go along just so that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about here today. Um, I'm just gonna start with a couple stories though, and in the case of these stories, I'm gonna tell them to you as I experience them, and I'm not gonna stop and do that explaining work until we get to the end and start drawing out the lessons from those stories, and then thinking about how they apply to what we're all thinking about and praying about in our communities today. Really want to make the ideas in this talk today as practical as possible, and I know the folks in Rockville have really been praying for their community and praying for the world, and so we're going to just try and show how the lessons in what we find in the Bible and what we're discussing today apply to that real world stuff we're thinking about. So first, these two brief stories. The first one is from a number of years ago when I was attending a conference. It was a week-long conference that had been going really quite well. People were enjoying themselves. And when we got to the very last session, there was a few thousand participants. It was a big auditorium, and the wrap-up session was a Q&A with the organizers. Well, in this Q&A, somebody asked a question that turned out to be pretty controversial. It was not a topic that I was passionate about or had really thought that much about. Definitely didn't have a strong opinion. But as the first organizer tried to answer that question, it seemed to generate a kind of frustration, not just among the people who asked the question, but among other people in the audience. And that frustration seemed to start to spread as the second organizer, the third, and the fourth organizer all took a stab at answering this question. And it seemed like each time one made an effort to try and help and respond, the frustration only grew. And it grew into irritation and anger on a scale that seemed to start just bringing everybody up, or the majority of us anyway, up into that intense feeling that I think at some point kind of peaked with what you might even be able to call a mob mentality. Now, I was swept up in it as much as anyone else, and I didn't really even realize it. I just remember feeling angry like everybody else, and why aren't they answering the question in a straightforward way, and that kind of stuff. And then the fifth organizer stood up. Now, this person, I have met her since that day. She's a Christian Scientist, and she was praying. And as we come back to this story, we'll talk about how things looked from her perspective and how she was thinking about things. I don't remember the words she said, but I remember that she talked about love. And maybe even more than what she talked about, I remember that she was living love. She helped the folks in that audience that day feel love. And as she spoke, and as this feeling of love started to spread out, it was kind of like there was this big inflated balloon that was on the burst of popping violently, and then somehow somebody just let the air out real fast. It was just like, just went right out. That's when I realized I'd been swept up in this kind of mob mentality. Hadn't realized it when I was there, but as it was gone, it kind of felt like waking up. And I remember feeling a little disturbed, like, wow, I can't, I wasn't even thinking. And I remember also like thinking if there's just such a thing as mass hypnotism, I think that was it. Because I was just so swept up in the intensity, but then as it was gone, I felt more like myself. I felt like I could think again, and started having more my own thoughts. I think basically everybody felt that because the conversation shifted, the whole scene, the feeling in the room changed, and the rest of the Q&A session and event was able to go forward on a collegial, constructive, unified kind of ground. So I'm not sure the question was 100% answered that day, but I do feel like there was progress as people were able to think more like themselves, constructively and in a useful way. So we'll pause that story there for just a minute. We'll leave it there. And like I said, we'll come back to it and we'll look at it from the angle of the person who is on stage and in some of the lessons we can maybe extrapolate. Suffice to say, I think as we look out at the news today and think about our lives, part of the reason I'm telling this story is because I think any one of us can feel that feeling of being swept up. Whether it's in a reaction to something we hear about or in the headlines, or into what feels like just our own kind of fear about things. So that's part of what we want to get at with that story as we unpack things more. But let's transition to the second story, and we're going to bring these lessons together. The second story is on a more micro level, and it's from a number of years ago. It's from earlier. Well, I guess it's not this year because it was in 2021. It was, there was a dad who texted me late at night, and he asked me to pray with him and with his son. His son was in his 20s and had grown up going to church, had gotten away from church, and had, I think, experimented with drugs and different things. And the son, though, had reached out to his dad at this point because he was in the emergency room at a hospital. And he was feeling what he felt were pretty severe symptoms of COVID, quite a bit of pain and breathing issues and things. And he'd asked his dad if he would pray for him. And so the dad then asked, well, would it be okay too if I reach out to somebody else to also pray with us? And so that's why he texted me in my role as a Christian Science practitioner. A practitioner is somebody who is available to pray with people for healing in regard to whatever issues people are struggling with in their life. And so as the dad texted me, we texted back and forth some ideas. My hope was to comfort him, to give him some inspiration to maybe pass on to his son. And then I also prayed quietly, apart from just, what was said. Part of what came in those prayers and what was shared related to a line in the Bible where St. Paul is speaking to a pretty diverse group of people and is telling them a little bit about God from his point of view. He says that it's in God we live and move and have our being. And I was also thinking about another line in the Bible about God being love itself. These ideas have been helpful to me in other circumstances before, especially when it feels like just the atmosphere around us has somehow harmed us or invaded our harmony and our space. It's not like there's one way to pray, but it was a thought that came back to me that had helped me in the past too. But it grew from there. This idea that a God is love and that it's in God that we live and move and have our being, gave that impression that this guy and all of us is defined by that love, that he lived and moved and had his being in that love, that was his atmosphere, that he couldn't take in anything in the atmosphere around him that wasn't like God, that wasn't good, that wasn't like love. That he could feel that love right there with him, that whatever else seemed to have power in him, be it disease, be it fear, be it maybe a feeling of unworthiness, like, gosh, I haven't prayed in a long time. Do I even deserve this? Do I even know how? That whatever that stuff was that didn't match up with a love that is God itself, that really wasn't as defining of an atmosphere for him as God's love was. He was at this point in this waiting area of the emergency room where he was semi-quarantined, I think, and waiting for a doctor to see him. and not just dealing with the symptoms, but dealing with fear. And as I thought about this space and not just the love that surrounded him, I thought about how that love was just filling the hallways outside the room. Thinking about the care providers out there running around and trying to help as many people as they possibly could. The other people who were there for help, that the same love that was the very atmosphere in which we live and move and breathe and have our being was there comforting, inspiring the people who are there to help, giving them courage, giving them strength and endurance, just taking the fears away from those who were worried about what was going to come next. That you just imagine that big love filling all space and defining our thoughts, our character, our well-being, our health, and everything. That was the big idea that was growing for me anyway in my prayer that evening. And as I said, we texted back and forth a few times. And after an hour, he started to tell me that his son was not feeling so afraid and feeling some improvement. And within about 2 hours, he said that his son was feeling completely well. All the symptoms had gone away. He was feeling normal, like himself. He was feeling healthy. He waited there until he was able to be seen and tested. And when that finally happened, the test came back that he did not have COVID, and so he was able to go home. And he went forward as far as I know, and remained healthy. So let's just talk about what brings these stories together and has to do with our theme today of spiritual discovery in a time of upheaval. For me, a key word in both those stories that I think we can begin with is prayer. Now, there are many ways to look at prayer, as we said before, but let's go to one instance in the Bible where it's said that Jesus' students came to him and asked him, "How do you pray?" And in this account, Jesus replies that first and foremost, we should go into our closet. And in the context of that phrase, he's talking about how prayer shouldn't be about what it looks like to other people. Prayer shouldn't be a show. It shouldn't be about doing something in front of others and getting their opinions and that kind of stuff. So go into your closet's a little bit like go into this just private space in your sense of you and God, and step back from all the opinions and preconceived notions around you. I would say too that maybe we could say that if we carry that a little bit further, prayer could be a way of also stepping back from our own surface level views of things and preconceived notions and opinions about things, our own knee-jerk reactions in some intense moment, our own fears. And then, so after this idea of take a step back, Jesus gives what many Christians today call the Lord's Prayer. And in summary, broad brushstroke, the Lord's Prayer talks a little bit about God's nature, gives us an indication of that and of our relationship with God and what that means in our lives. So if we were to just look at this in a really broad kind of a way, when Jesus is asked, "How do you pray?" he talks about taking a step back from the fear and the reaction, the opinions, the surface level views, and getting focused on the nature of God and on our relationship with God. So if we all kind of have maybe an idea of what it means to take a step back for a second, but if the next part for prayer is getting focused on the nature of God, well, let's talk about that for just a minute. What is God? Well, God is an infinite subject, so there are many ways of looking at God. But let's go back to the Bible, and particularly to Jesus. One word that Jesus uses for God is spirit. Now, spirit may sound like a pretty abstract, far out there, removed kind of word or concept from daily life today. But if we just look at it for a minute, the word spirit is an English translation of a word that is originally written in Greek, if you're looking at the New Testament, where Jesus' life and teachings and works are all described. New Testament in the Bible. And then what Christians call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, also the first part of the Christian Bible, is A surprise, written in Hebrew. But that word spirit, the word that's translated into spirit, both from the Hebrew and the Greek, it has the same meaning in both words, and it's actually translated not just as spirit, but in various points as wind or even as breath. And this connects with a way Jesus talks about spirit at one point when he says that he's talking at that moment about spirit and says, well, the wind comes and you don't know where it's coming from, you don't know where it's going, but you can see the leaves moving in the trees. So the idea for me is that, like the very air we breathe, God is ever present. God is everywhere. We don't think a lot about the air. We don't think a lot about our breath, but it's integral to life. And if it wasn't there, we would notice it pretty fast. In fact, the Bible says that God is life. So all of that just connects for me. The idea that God is life itself, is love itself, as we said before, and is ever present, is not something that we see, but we see the effect of God. We don't see love, for example, but we see love expressed in acts of kindness and generosity. Another word for God in the Bible is truth. Well, in the same way, you don't see truth, but you can see truth expressed in acts of honesty and integrity. So God is not something we see, but God is a power and a presence, and is life itself, is love itself and truth itself. And there's an effect from God that is tangible, that is visible. Two more things about what God says about the Bible, and then we'll build on that, is number one, that God made everything that was made, and nothing was made that God didn't make, and that God is pure good. And one other phrase, that the same source doesn't send forth both fresh water and salty water. So the idea here is that God made all that was made, that God is pure good, that God is love, God is life, God is truth, and that source doesn't also send forth something opposite to its nature. That love doesn't create hate or even allow for it or somehow use it for some long-term gain. That life doesn't use destruction, deterioration, disease, death for some benefit to life. That it cannot include anything unlike its nature. So the pureness, the goodness of God is an ever-presence, is a power, we could say the very principle of the universe, that is the cause of all that is fundamental, natural, the stuff that's really unavoidable. And that anything else that's unlike that is not as unavoidable as it seems, not as fundamental to our nature, not as grounded in the way things are made to be. So let's now look a little bit, and then we're going to bring us all together at what the next part of what Jesus said prayer is means. If that's something of what God is, based on some of the things the Bible says, then what does it mean that what is our relationship with God? If prayer is about looking at what God is and our relationship to God, well, what is that? Well, the very first thing the Bible says about our relationship with God is on about page 2, and it says that we're made in the very likeness of God. Now, that's not a one-off kind of concept in the Bible. It's a theme that comes out at various points. Jesus, for example, says, "Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." St. Paul says, "Put off the old man and put on the new man, which is created to be like God." Put off an old sense of yourself. Accept the new sense of yourself, which is created to be like God. Now here's one other phrase that I really like from the Hebrew scriptures, from the Hebrew prophet Isaiah. And he's writing in a poetic way, like as if it's the voice of God talking to us. And he says, "Bring my sons from far and my daughters from the ends of the earth, everyone who's called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made." Well, sons from far, daughters from the ends of the earth, that's everybody, right? That's all inclusive. Called by God's name, well, in the Bible, the name of the king or the name of God is about the authority of God or the king or whatever it may be. And the nature of, so to be called by God's name is to be called in the power of God and in the nature of God. and formed and made by God. Well, if all this has to do with the kind of God we were talking about, maybe that sounds pretty good. Did you hear the purpose word, though? It said, for my glory. Well, one way to define glory, to glorify something, is to make it known. And one way we could make God known is by going out to the street corner and talking about God, shouting about God. We could do things in the name of God. And that would all be good. But this phrase isn't talking about what we say or what we do so much as who we are, our very being. We're made for the glory of God. And to me, this connects with this idea that we don't see God, but we see the effect of God. If God is love and God is life and God is truth, and we're the very image of God, the effect of God, then we're the place where that love shines through. We're the place where life takes form. We're the place where truth is made manifest. Of all that is good and like God's nature, that is actually who and what we're made to be. Not in cookie cutter kind of ways, because we're talking about an infinite source. And so there are infinite and diverse ways that good of God can be expressed, but it always must include the kind of qualities and characteristics that come from the source. So we're made then to be free, to be whole, to be purposeful and valuable, to be effective in life, to be hopeful in life, to do good, to be the place where good shines through. Well, here's where we need to connect some dots, because this is not often how we think about ourselves. It's not often how we think about other people. It's certainly not what we tend to see in the headlines. I don't know about you, but I use my phone for my alarm in the morning, and I reach over and sometimes I start looking at those news alerts right away or throughout the day. Maybe you flip on the radio, there's lots of ways, but I don't know about you, and the last time you saw headlines that made you think, oh gosh, there's a little bit more of the glory of God shining through today. It's not just the kind of refrain that we're getting when we look out. Now, there's lots of good stuff in the world and lots of good stuff going on. It looks like a mixture, though. Looks like there's good and a lot of other stuff for us to be worried about. And the Bible addresses that concept, too, of why it looks mixed together. Right after it says we're made in the likeness of God, it gives this allegory about these two characters who, Adam and Eve, you probably know the story, that are in this garden of good, and then they're tempted to eat from something in that garden called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, it's a tree of knowledge, so it's about our thinking. It's about what we're accepting as true. And this good and evil, though, this good and evil version or way of looking at things, when they bite into that fruit, the first thing they feel is guilt. And then they feel kicked out of the garden of good. They feel like they're made to suffer and strive to fight for their little piece of the pie, and like there's not enough good to go around anymore. And that's all natural. Well, the Bible has a lot of ways about talking about the stuff that we face. Words like temptation, deception, accusation, lie. These are the kind of words that come out when evil itself, or whatever you want to put under that umbrella, the sufferings of humanity, the fears of humanity, are being dealt with throughout the examples, the lives, the stories, the teachings in the Bible. It's never in the concept of being rooted in something fundamental and unavoidable as much as it is, again, a deception is, well, it's something that can be corrected with truth. An accusation has the implication that, well, those who are being accused are truly innocent and not what the accuser says they are. A temptation is the idea of being drawn away from what is normal and natural, from what is good, and led astray, but only in thinking, not in a way that has, originated in how things are and are made to be. Even the Bible talks about God in a diverse ways. We talked about all these good things about God, but if you know the Bible, you might say, no, hey, wait a second. There are plenty of places in the Bible where it talks about God as, giving life and destroying, loving and hating. And since we're rooting everything we talk about in the Bible today, I think it's important to know we don't want to just pick and choose our little parts that we believe or don't believe. The whole Bible has important lessons for us. And if we look at it in the right lens, the lens of Jesus' life and Jesus' teachings, then we get the idea that what we can see is this journey, this evolution of the people's idea of God over a long period of time. The Bible's written by men and women and people with different ideas about God, and rich and poor, and so there's a lot of diversity there. And when you read something like, say, from Moses, who says, "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," and then Jesus comes along later and says, "No more of this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth stuff. I say, love your enemy." Well, it could look like there's just a contradiction in the Bible. And sometimes people walk away from the Bible because they feel like there's just contradictions. But again, if we look at it as an evolution, let's look at Moses for just a second, and we'll make it clear why we're talking about all this. Before Moses said that, if you came and killed my brother, I could go kill your whole village. And so the law said, if you kill my brother, well, I can only kill your brother. That might not sound like the highest thing in our concept of justice and peace and progress in society today. But if you think about it, for that time, what that was evolving from Moses' highest idea about God. God is a God of justice, a God of truth, and a God of equity and principle. It meant that the homicide rate dropped by like 95%. Find me a politician today who can do that, and we don't go, hey, that's progress. So something was evolving, progress was happening, and that progress was happening because of the clearer idea of God that was dawning and was guiding human thoughts, human actions, and the kind of laws and the kind of society that was being built on it. It wasn't the end of the story. Humanity has continued to evolve, and again, when we get to the life of Jesus in the Bible, we see the clearest idea of God's nature. And it's through that lens that we can look at whatever's in the Bible, appreciate what's being learned, and realize we all have the same lessons to learn too. We in society are still learning those lessons, so they still have value when viewed through that Christly lens. And so as we talk about the Bible, as we use the Bible as a way to extrapolate our lessons today, some of you may know the Bible, some of you may not, but just the themes that we see there are really, they tie into our key point here today of spiritual discovery. To me, discovery is what has progressed humanity throughout human history. And I feel like that's what we see going on in the Bible too. A discovery means something's already there. It means it's not just somebody's opinion. It's not just somebody's positive thinking. The laws of aerodynamics were discovered. You may know, certainly you know about the Wright brothers. You may also know about other folks like Santos Dumont from Brazil and others that were all learning and understanding better the laws of aerodynamics around the same time. The Wright brothers were labeled the first in flight, but all these folks, it wasn't my laws of aerodynamics and your laws of aerodynamics, it was the laws. And they were discovering them. They were understanding better what was already there. And the more they understood it, the more they could build on it. Not one of them went up to a tall hill and just thought positively about flying and jumped off. It's not positive thinking, genuine discovery. Genuine discovery means you're better perceiving what's there. And it wasn't like they had the whole picture, but what they were understanding, as much as it was rooted in reality, they were able to build on it, prove something with it. To me, that's what I think we see going on in the Bible. Whether it's that story of Moses or stories about folks in war who find safety, or folks in famine who find food, or folks who've been outcast from society that find community again, or folks labeled as incurable that find health and wholeness again. What I feel like one of these golden threads throughout the Bible is these folks that when they're in the middle of war and they step back and they turn to their idea of God, whatever their highest idea of God is, to the degree that that informs them, their next actions, their reasoning, is to the degree that they find safety or food or whatever. And sometimes they even save their enemies too, as well as themselves. The more that true idea of God is shining through, the more we see God-like qualities or characteristics being felt, being experienced in these human lives. And so to me, that's we're just looking at the Bible as a source book for what is that? What are those perceptions about God that we also can understand and build on today? What can we discover for ourselves? Looking back at what Jesus said about prayer, being take a step back from the fear and the reaction and the surface appearance. Maybe he would have said the news alerts sometimes, or our own self-condemnations and things, and looking at the nature of God, looking at our relationship with God, and looking at that not as just some positive thought, but as something we can really begin to dig into and genuinely discover. Not just a positive thought we're trying to hold on to and believe it and make it work, but something that actually hits us, dawns on us, informs us. I mean, those folks looking for the laws of aerodynamics, they were like, the more they understood it, it was like, aha, it sort of did something with them. And I feel like that's how truth works. It's when we're looking in that direction and something jumps out at us and just makes us see things in a slightly different way, or maybe in a very different way, and gives us a whole new sense of where we are and what's going on, what has power in the world, what's normal and what's natural. To me, that's spiritual discovery. It's discovery rooted in God's nature, God being spirit, and that which is spiritual, meaning that which comes from God. So spiritual discovery is discovering that which is coming from God, that which we're made to be, discovering that good is real, that good is natural, good is something we can feel and experience, and not burying our head in the sand and ignoring problems or evils, but actually realizing that the way to progress is to look at what is normal and natural in order to face down the stuff that is not so fundamental and natural as it seems and unavoidable as it seems, but to discover and build on what is. Here's a brief little analogy for you. If I wrote 7 plus 3 equals on my little imaginary board here, 7 plus 3, equals what? 73? No? 10? Yes. Well, how do you know? What if somebody only told you that the plus sign means you put them together, and you hadn't learned math yet, and so all you had was the surface level logic of 7 and 3, and the plus means you put them together, so you get a 73. Well, there's a certain surface level logic to that. It's not correct. It has nothing to do with the principle of math. And if we try and do our grocery shopping or balance our checking account with that kind of math, there's going to be suffering. It's not going to feel good. Well, I would say we're talking about how to connect the dots between these ideas of what God is and what we are and what we deal with on a daily basis. Okay, so we discover it, it's already there, but how does that have an impact? Well, when we look out, and let's just look back at, for example, that story with that young guy, the surface level logic would say maybe he was exposed to something, to some disease that caused him to feel the way he was feeling. Maybe his previous life choices and things that had burdened him and weighed on him, made him afraid, distracted and tempted him, had an impact on his feeling of worthiness and closeness to God. Maybe the people in the hallways running to help others had real good reason, doing a double shift, seeing a lot of suffering in front of them, to feel burden and to feel anxious and so forth. The surface level logic is obvious in those equations, kind of like it might be to somebody who doesn't know math that 7 plus 3 equals 73. It's not to make light of it, but it is to say what happened as we prayed together that day. The surface level logic, many of us have probably experienced it too. We would say, well, gosh, I don't know. I've been in situations where it seemed like I was with someone who was unwell, and the next day I was feeling similar symptoms. Like, it's not that I didn't experience that. Okay, yes. But what do we do about it? Well, the prayer, the way of stepping back from the surface level logic, the surface level appearances, the fears and the reactions to all that, and to getting focused on God's nature and on what that means. To me, that's what we were doing in that prayer that day. We were discovering something more about what actually did and always had define the nature, the well-being, the heart, the thoughts of that young guy. That it might not have looked that way on the surface, but you add a 7 and a 3 together and you end up with a 1 and a 0. That doesn't match up on surface level logic. But in the principle of math, it sure does. And if you test it, if you live by it, then you're going to see it alleviates the suffering of reasoning from 7 and 3 equals 73. That things work a lot more smoothly when you're building on a 7 plus 3 equals 10 kind of basis in your grocery shopping or whatever. Well, we were building on a different basis. We were seeing more where that young guy's health and well-being came from, and where the inspiration and his feeling of connectedness and being loved, of where he was in that atmosphere of love, safe, of the people in the hallway the same way, and the people everywhere. To me, we were discovering something. It wasn't that we were doing something. We were believing it hard enough, but it was like hitting us. It was dawning on us. We were turning to that. It's a little like somebody opening the light and the light comes in. You're not the power just because you open the window, but the light that comes in has the power. It dispels the darkness. It helps you see better. The more you can see, the more you can navigate the room with harmony. Well, he was able to navigate his life, his experience in that moment with a little more harmony, with a little more of what was normal and natural, and that which had never really been inherent in him and defining of him started to recede and fade away and not be seen and experienced in the same way, because it was a perspective more than it was a fundamental reality. I think we could apply this to that other story too, and it maybe helps us think about how we pray on a bigger scale. That woman standing on stage, I don't know about you, but if I was up there, the temptation might have been great to look out at a sea of 3,000 faces, angry mob, and not see love. But that woman's prayers that day helped lift her to see a big love that wasn't just, for this person and that person and that person and that person in the audience, but a principle that was the cause governing everything and everybody there. She wasn't there to try and change people's thinking or make them believe what she believed. It was just to bear witness to what was already true. And that's great Bible language, bearing witness. We're not the cause, we're watching, we're observing or discovering the cause and better perceiving its effect. So it was like she opened the window and the light came in. And the thing is, when the light comes in, it doesn't just help the one person who opened the window. There could be 10 people in the room, and it helps everybody in the room. They don't have to start believing what you believe and thinking what you think, but they're benefited by the light. I feel like that's what happened. Her prayer led her to better see the light of love, of its power, naturally informing everybody there, our inherent ability to think constructively, and not be swept up mindlessly, that we weren't defined or made by a God that made us mindless and made us capable of being manipulated and swept off our feet in mob mentality. That's not natural. That's not actually a power. It can seem like a power. If you look at it on the surface, you may react and try and reason with it, and that's what everyone else was doing, but it didn't have the same effect as the person who stepped back from that whole scene and said, no, I'm going to bear witness to what is true and I'm going to act on that. It definitely was not ignoring the situation. It's what healed the situation. Her witness to love was felt by everybody. The light that was let in by that prayer, doesn't matter how many people were in the scope of that moment and in that prayer, they were blessed by that light. And so I would say that just helps us think about how we take what we're talking about here, this concept of discovering spiritually, and reason out in a way that's broader than just our little problems. This is about what the light is and is doing for all people and the benefit that has. So let's talk a little bit about the how, and then I'm going to talk about one or two other brief points and some of the things that the folks in Rockville told me they're praying about in their community, and then tell you one more story, and we'll wrap up. The word Christ, to me, is integral to answering the question, how? How does all this work? Why does it work the way that it works? And Christ, you probably know, is not just the last name of Jesus. If it had a driver's license, it wouldn't have said Jesus Christ. Christ is a title. It symbolized that light of God that shone through his life, the presence, the activity, the power, the goodness of God that shone through his life so uniquely in human history. And Jesus showed us something unique about God's grace. And grace, in a very short phrase, could be the unearned love of God. Why is it unearned? Well, because it already is. It doesn't get more unearned than that. It's not about what you do. It's not about your works or what you say or how you pray or the building you go to. Again, we're discovering what already is. There's nothing more unearned than before you even ask for it, God's love is showing you that it's already there. Jesus showed us something unique about salvation. And in a very short phrase, we could maybe say that salvation is like discovering that nothing can or ever has separated us from this love of God. That the things that have us running off, getting swept up, tempting us, they make us run, but it's like running on a treadmill. That you can run for hundreds or thousands of miles, and then the second you stop, you realize you haven't gone anywhere. You've not departed from your original place. And it's like God is just there already. We turned and we thought we were getting away from God, and we realized nope, we never left. We're right here and we're connected. Good still is. Jesus showed us a little something about what real power looks like. The meekness, the love that helps us step back from opinions. It's not to go out there and try and cause change as much as it is discover what God is and what God is doing. It's not, people expected the Messiah to be this political leader or this, military leader. The Bible says folks were looking for a lion and they got a lamb. What does it mean to have the hungering and thirsting after righteousness that Jesus talked about, the mercifulness and the meekness that it takes to better discover what God is and what God is doing, and to be led by that? And that doesn't mean we're always going to be quiet and stay at home. Sometimes those kinds of discoveries lead us to bold actions that run contrary to what people are saying. But when it's informed by that sense of God, then it's different. It's different than self-will. That true sense of God's nature is what we see shining through Jesus' life, and it's that same true idea of what God is and what God is doing that is always with us. The presence and activity of God did not start when Jesus came and when Jesus left. It's always with us, and it's right here and now too. It's in our communities today. It's in the world today. And the narrative that wants to sometimes tempt us to make us think we're headed off in the wrong direction is ignorant of the fact that there is a cause that is moving us, and it's moving us out from God's nature. It's the power, and that if we don't want to get swept up in the suffering that is caused when we see things in another way, we can better discover that and let it inform our actions. That true idea of what God is and what God is doing, that's Christ. That's what comes to us. It inspires us. It lifts us up. We don't always feel like we know what to do or what to think. And I would actually say every day should be a day of discovery. It's great to be grateful for what we already know, what we've learned, what we've experienced that's good in life. But to discover something new in the face of what seems to be the opposition or the difficulty of the day, knowing that there is an answer, knowing that there is a way to be moved to better see what God is and what God is doing that will directly deal with that trend, whatever it may be. Now, I know, for example, the folks in Rockland told me they're praying about the diversification in the community, which they're really grateful for, and but also the friction that can cause sometimes, and wanting to just see more of the harmony and naturalness of the unity of God's family, living side by side, coming together, loving one another, growing and not losing individuality, but at the same time, feeling united and like one family and able to work together. Well, what are the elements in that? If that's the kind of thing we want to pray about, just as one example, how do we take a step back from the things that feel like, well, here's almost inevitably or quite naturally what would cause friction? And then look at, well, but wait a second, what is it about God's nature and how God has made us to be that much more naturally causes unity, causes harmony, causes understanding, causes appreciation for one another, causes equality? How do we act on that? How does that inform the way I see my neighbor? How does it inform the way I take in the news and think about what I can do to make a difference in society? We think about kids' education in school and folks saying, well, they've been disrupted, upheaval from the pandemic, and maybe this kind of lost generation is going to suffer from that. Well, wait a second. Yeah, there may seem to be a surface level logic to that. Let's not ignore that. But let's go a little deeper. What is it that opens up opportunity and understanding for the future going forward? How do we see the direct connection that individuals have with that? Everybody, little kids and everyone. God's goodness is like a river that flows, or like a stream going down a mountainside. If you put a big boulder in front of that stream going down the mountain, that water, it's going to go over it, around it, pool up, and then kind of run into the next logical channel based on where gravity pulls it. It's not going to stop. We expect the good in life to come from certain channels, but when it seems disrupted or upheaval seems to just, pull it all apart, what our prayer can do is help us take a step back and acknowledge, no, there's a law of God, a cause of God that is unavoidable, that is causing goodness, and meekness, humility, hungering and thirsting after that goodness will help me find the channel in which it's flowing today, will help me overcome the fear that it's not flowing today, or that I can't find it, or that I don't have access to it, or that somebody else doesn't. There are many folks we'd like to pray for in the world that, it feels like we feel bad that maybe they can't get what they need. But our prayer can help inform us that, no, that ever-presence of God is flowing, the goodness of God flowing from that ever-presence. And our prayer can help us genuinely see that. At first, that may just seem so far-fetched from how things appear to be, and it's okay to feel incredulous when we encounter that idea. That's good, because we're engaging with it and we're wrestling with it. And that incredulousness can turn, as we look at it more and look at what the nature of God means, can turn into curiousness. Could it be possible? What if this is really true? What would that mean for us? That's working at that spiritual discovery and not just saying, well, this is it, there's nothing we can do. And at some point, for me, that curiousness tends to turn into awe as it begins to become clear, this is real. Like, you start to feel like, not just I believe it, but I'm seeing it, I'm understanding it. And I'm getting ideas for what to do and how to act on that, and what that means for other people. Feeling led by that true idea of God, not feeling like we're doing something of our own power. This is what real Christianity is about. It's not about the building we go to. It's not about something we earn or work our way up to. It's about that just step-by-step relationship with God, listening, discovering, following, facing down the stuff of the day that just is unlike God's nature and doesn't deserve to be around. Proving more, experiencing more of what God is and what God is doing. This movement, this approach to this practice of Christianity, it isn't about a new doctrine or a new creed or something. It is about that practical walk, that daily living, that understanding that relationship with God and proving it more. And this approach is founded by Mary Baker Eddy, who lived in the 1800s into the 1900s, and is a woman who is a pretty incredible model, because not only did she experience healing in her life from chronic illness from the time she was a little girl and other severe accident and other things, but helped other people find healing, like a lot of other people. And helped those people understand what was going on well enough that they could go out and they helped other people, who then turned around and helped other people who find healing. It's been a grassroots movement from the beginning, because it's always been about what looking at the principle of all this means for absolutely everybody on an equal level. It's called Christian Science, or the science of Christ, because it's about that understanding what Christ is, understanding what was at work in Jesus' life, seeing that it's timeless and universal, seeing that we can understand and prove it and live it and experience it. And you know, this woman, she didn't just help herself and then help some other people, but she broke through a lot of the groupthink or the oppression of her time, just like for women, for example. I mean, this woman was active and preaching and helping people, giving her life to talking about what she was discovering at a time when it wasn't even legal for women to vote, and it was considered immoral for women to even speak publicly, let alone, you know, write and preach about spiritual matters. But think about what it is to take a step back from all those public perceptions and to just think, well, what is God? What does that mean about me today? Not where have I been, not what kind of an education do I have, not what kind of, you know, what do people think, or what's my gender, or how much money do I have, but just what is God? What does that mean for me? Not where does society, you know, trending now, and just, but what is God and what does that mean? And then just with meekness, how do I let that shine through? Not with self-will, I'm going to get out there and I don't care what anybody else thinks. That's not at all the point. It's just, how does the light of God shine through and take shape when we're letting it do that? Mary Baker Eddy wrote, she wrote this book, Science and Health, The Key to the Scriptures. This is considered the textbook of Christian Science. It's a book about the Bible and how we understand the Bible and experience it in our lives. And the last 100 pages of this book are all stories of people who wrote in after reading the book because they found healing in their lives, many times of things that have been labeled as incurable. She spoke, as I said, she pioneered in copyright law. She was a philanthropist. At 87 years old, she started an international newspaper. Well, there's another surface level thing. How many folks at 87 are thinking, what should I do today? I know, go start an international newspaper. But, you know, she was operating at a time where just clear-cut, straightforward, honest journalism was really needed. And she thought, you can't heal if you don't know what's really going on in the world. Just more evidence that this isn't about burying your head in the sand. It's about being informed and then thinking constructively about what to do about that. So it's just not self-power. None of it is. It's not about how do I have the mental fortitude to hold on to the right idea. It's about how does turning in meekness to that true idea of God uplift and move us, empower good in our world, and help us prove it. For Mary Baker Eddy, this was all part of what Jesus promised was normal and natural when he said things like, you know, whoever follows me will do the works that I do. It's more than just blind belief. It's a daily walk. It's living it. So I'm going to read you a quick passage from the book and from the Bible, and I'm going to tell you one brief last story before we wrap up. So this line is, again, from Science and Health, and Mary Baker Eddy wrote, "The conceptions of mortal, erring thought must give way to the ideal of all that is perfect and eternal. Through many generations, human beliefs will be attaining diviner conceptions, and the immortal and perfect model of God's creation will finally be seen as the only true conception of being." The next sentence starts with the word science. She's talking about the science of Christ. She says, "It reveals the possibility of achieving all good and sets mortals at work to discover what God has already done." So there's that idea of that evolution in thought, of what God has already done, of who and what we already are, getting diviner, more spiritual ideals and conceptions of what's going on, and then acting on that till we really see it, not just believe it while the ship goes down. Corresponding with that for me is this passage from St. Paul in the Bible, who writes, "Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we'll see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete, but then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely." So it seems like a mixture of good and evil, but what God already sees is what we're seeing step by step by step. And it's not this miraculous thing. Healing to me is not a miracle, and it's not that man like God coming in and hooking us up with a little good. It's the total naturalness of what is already true dawning and being better understood. And that again is what I feel discovery is, and has been all throughout human history, is we better see and perceive what is, and then act on that, build on that, conform to that. So this last quick story is I'm telling it for a couple reasons, and one is because I know sometimes we feel like, well, who am I? I feel a little helpless to help others, or maybe I don't know enough. It's because sometimes we look out and we feel like, well, even if I do, then something good and have good prayers, that that there's just people out there that I don't know about who are suffering, or maybe about to do harm, and or that are unreachable. And so I know, for example, the folks in Rockville are praying about the news that went out about the congressman's son in their area that had committed suicide, about crime in the area that has seemed to have been increasing. These are difficult things on the surface, and they're not, we all want to do more, but we can feel like, gosh, well, but what do I do? It's not that this story has all the answers, but it's just one way, and that, or one illustration maybe of a moment where we can kind of think about how to think about that stuff differently. So this is a story of a time when I was in high school, and a friend of mine, we weren't super close, but we hung out once in a while, and mostly we hung out when he wanted to ride to school. So he would walk from his place and come over to my house. He came from a family that had a lot of difficulties and was in a household that was just not an easy one to be in. And one morning he came over to the house early in the morning, much earlier than normal. And so because he was so early, he didn't just ring the bell. He walked around to the side of the house and he knocked on the window to my room. Well, I got up and went and let him in, and we talked for a minute, and then I said, well, I got to start getting ready for school. So I grabbed my stuff and went to the restroom to do that. Well, I realized I'd forgotten something, and so I went back to my room, and I found him in my room in a chair with a knife out. He'd been running that knife up and down his arm, and there were some scratch marks. But as I walked in, he folded up the knife and he put it in his pocket. And I was kind of stunned, but he said, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's nothing. I was messing around, and maybe I messed around a little too much because of the scratches, but don't worry about it." I didn't feel like I knew what to say. I didn't feel like I knew what to do. And so I grabbed my things and I said, okay, and went back to the bathroom and started taking a shower. But as I was in the shower, the thought came to me really strongly, something's really wrong. You got to do something about it. I felt afraid at first, but as I did my best to turn to my highest idea of God at that time, I started to get some bigger impressions of what God was, of the love of God that was there with him. I'd probably articulate it now in a way that's better said than I ever thought it at the time, but the feeling is the same. What I started to feel was that really there was a love that was there with him. That even though I couldn't be there, even though I didn't know what to say, even though the whole thing seemed much bigger than me, there was something much, much bigger than all that. And not just much bigger, but ultimately only. That the love of God, that presence of God, if it's ever present, all presence, didn't leave room for something unlike itself. My sense of the bigness of that presence and activity of God just started to grow. It felt to me the implications of that, like this love that had made him, had to have made him inherently receptive to that love. That his understanding and feeling, his ability to feel, came from his maker, not from the way his family had been, or how he'd grown up, or anything else. that actually what defined his openness and receptivity, his ability to respond to that love and to understand that love, was love itself, was that God, which is his maker. I started to feel like that love was just really all that was there, and just so sure that he was in communion with it, and that it was guiding him and caring for him, and that it was the all power, and there was literally no room for anything else, any other fear, any other sadness or sorrow or suffering. That was the whole of that moment and what was happening. I found a peace that came to me as this bigger feeling of love and its presence and activity dawned on me. So I went on getting ready, and as I finished and went back to the room, I found him in the room in the chair asleep. When we got up, or he got him up, and we went to the kitchen and had a bowl of cereal, and then got in the car and started driving to school. As we were almost to school, he said, "I have to tell you something." And I said, "Okay." He said, "I want you to know that today I came over to your house early because I had intended to commit suicide." He said, "I wanted to do it at your house because I feel so much more peaceful here than at my house." And then he started to tell me about how he had intended to do it, and there's ways where you can be saved and ways you can't be saved if you cut yourself a certain way and that kind of stuff. And then, but at the end of all that, he said, "But something changed. After you left the room, I got my knife back out and I was going to do it." And he said, "But then all of a sudden I started to feel this big love." He said, "I can't explain it. I just felt loved." And he said, "I just sat there feeling that love, and now I know for sure that I'm never going to do that." He said, "You don't have to worry about me. I promise you that any sense of that is completely gone. Even if I feel sad again, it's just that's not the way I'm going to deal with it. I know there's a way forward." And I still didn't feel like I knew what to say, but I expressed gratitude, and we went on to school. We stayed in touch a little bit. We haven't been in touch in a while, but I know he's around and still doing well. I see him on Facebook and that kind of stuff. When it looks like there's a situation out there and we don't know what to do or how to handle it, it's helpful to remember this isn't about some personal qualifications. This is about what God is and what God is doing. So much temptation draws us into thinking that the world is the way it is, or we are the way that we are, and that we have to start from that basis as we reason out what's possible, but we don't. We can start from the basis of God's nature, of our relationship with God, and how that defines all things, how it defines our community and our world. There's plenty to discover there, but it's not a burden. It's not that we have to take on all the misperceptions of the world. It's that moment by moment, we get to just listen, and we get to follow with meekness, with humility, with love, just hungering to see more of it. And whatever it is ours to see, ours to know, ours to discover that day. God's leading us in that. It's taking burdens away. It's freeing us up. It's helping us feel more like ourselves, and helping us just have confidence in the inherent goodness, the power of good that is present and that is defining of creation of our world. This includes everybody. It includes strangers. It includes the politicians we like and the ones we don't like, and the corporate leaders we like or don't like, the emergency workers, the folks that feel like they're being swept up in crime in the community and don't feel like they have another choice. It includes the people who feel like they have failed and lost, and it's over and it's done with, and it's too late to help or heal because the problem has happened and it's done. It opens our eyes more to this big sense of our life in and of God. And little by little, it helps us prove that. Always with what will meet the need for this moment, just at this time, so that as we take that step, then we're ready for the next moment to take the next step and the next, to be safe every step of the way, to help others feel that too. I'm going to pause now, and I will pop over now to the Q&A and just see if anything has come in. Somebody's asking, how do we share with family or friends who have different spiritual perspectives? How do we communicate about God's nature so that they can see the light and heal and be in harmony? Hopefully some of that last story helped, but bear in mind that it's not our job to change anyone or convince anyone as much as it is to bear witness to who and what people already are. I've seen and experienced that many times, including folks that seem just really at odds with one another, and helping even just one person in that relationship to look past what feels like the head-to-head kind of stuff, and just really, not just one time, but every time the thought comes, well, that person doesn't get it. Well, that person doesn't have it. Well, that person, whatever. To go, but wait a second. God, what do you see? What are you doing? That's not doing nothing. It's turning to the light and opening the window and letting that light come through. And it in Bible language, it leavens. It's like the yeast that you put in dough that helps leaven it. It's not us who are doing something with truth. It's truth is doing something with us. And when we bear witness to what truth is doing in somebody else, with somebody else, its idea, its creation, the very expression of God, the more that what seems to be or define somebody as being separate from God doesn't get room to be there anymore. Again, it doesn't mean like that these people are going to end up like we think they should or like we want them to, but in their own way, more like who they really are, more like what God is and what God is doing. That has to shine through. The stuff that holds people down, that oppresses people, that distracts people and gets people wrapped up in the busyness of life or in fear, that's not our fault. It's not personal to who we are. So when we pray about that stuff and better see the power of God that is contrary to that and overturning that, we're not changing somebody. We're dealing with a lie. We're dealing with a lie that isn't their lie. It's not my lie. It's not how do I pray about and change them or how do I change me. It's just how do I deal with impersonal error, a mistake, and then see the truly personal nature of the goodness that is at work in them. Truth has the power to overturn error, a lie, a mistake. That can be part of our prayer, because sometimes the thought comes, well, I like all these ideas, but how do I know they're going to work? Well, great. Take that question to your prayer. Don't pray with the assumption that I'm going to discover all this goodness, but I don't know if it's going to do any good. Pray about your prayer. If you're not sure if it's going to do any good, ask God for a little bit different picture of that. Not just affirming it and knowing I know it's going to work, but just hold on. Convince me, God. I want to engage with the truth, and I want what I'm discovering about God's nature to show me, to convince me, to educate me, to better see and understand what prayer is and how it works. That's not too much to ask. Every step of this is not something some of it we have to know, but the rest God can provide. Whatever it is, be it our own sense of ability to pray or even our own desire to pray, all of that comes from God. Literally everything good comes from God. And so prayer can be that step-by-step discovery of that until we feel convinced that we and others have what they need. And again, if we do all that, but then it seems like some problem persists, okay, what new? What else to discover? The laws of aerodynamics were not discovered in a day. Very little has changed in human history in a day. But it didn't stop, and people didn't have to just repeat what they'd done before over and over again. They had to discover more of what it meant for right now, more of what it meant for today, see it more clearly. That's the journey we're on. But every day we can be sure that what we're able to discover meets the need of today and guarantees us that we're going to get where we need to go. Hopefully that's helpful. Somebody else asked the question, how do we transmit, share to family or other people? Oh, this is a similar question. Truth about God, etc. There's some lovely people in this group who really want to share and help others. Thank you. hopefully what I just said is helpful for that. It looks like a similar question. There's another question here. Somebody has asked, how does spiritual discovery compete with discoveries made by scientists studying DNA and viruses, etc.? Once or twice a year, I address a medical classroom at Harvard Medical School, and similar questions come up, of course. And some of the conversation that I found really helpful is when we talk about how it is we can call this a science, and yet how it doesn't match up with how science is generally defined today. I mean, in order for something to be considered science, in general, it has to meet the criteria of what is called scientific method. It has to be able to be tested and blind tested and, tried to be proved wrong. And all, that's part of what is a valuable, respectable, genuine effort to vet what is true and what is not true. And all of that is great, except that when you talk about being able to prove what is true or not true simply by things that you can measure through observation, this is where it starts to pull away from a Christian science. The same rigor, the same testing and desire to vet what is true and not just take somebody's opinion and that kind of stuff to really get at the heart of it. All of those characteristics, there's a lot of commonality. But think about the qualities and characteristics that Jesus talked about the most. For example, in what Christians today have come to call the Sermon on the Mount, he starts with what people call the Beatitudes. Some of the qualities there are ones that I mentioned in the middle of the talk today, like hungering and thirsting after righteousness and meekness and, being merciful, being pure in heart is another one. Well, how do you measure those things? If those are the characteristics that Jesus seemed to indicate were central to the practice of Christianity, and you want to say, okay, so here's somebody that is going to pray for somebody else who has these surface level symptoms, and maybe we'll get 3 of those people that have similar surface level symptoms, and we'll pray and we'll observe and we'll measure and so forth. Well, but you can't measure how humble any one of those people were, either the folks wanting help or the person praying. You can't measure how much they were hungering and thirsting after righteousness. You can't. This is the stuff that, again, Jesus said, you can't see it. Love and truth and so on. So how could you, with just that limited kind of a method? I mean, even pain, which is physical, isn't able to be measured today. It's not something we can, measure that's visible. And so if you go into a room in a hospital, there's a little chart with usually about 10 emojis, and the patient is just asked how much pain do you feel, and they point to one of the emojis on a scale of that 1 to 10, and that's it. There's no better way to measure pain, and that's physical. Well, so the idea that it's a science, because of the characteristics that mean you don't just believe in it blindly. You have to understand it, and you have to demonstrate it, and if you don't, you go back and you learn more and you prove it that it's universal and so on. All of that corresponds, like I said, but these matters of thought and of heart that are unmeasurable are what make it different from the kinds of discoveries that just look at the surface appearance of things and say, well, here's what we can observe. I mean, we can get down to a micro level as we try and map out DNA and that kind of stuff. And again, you got to respect the process, because within the framework of saying, well, it's only can be called science if it's measurable, within that construct, people are doing great and dedicated work. But Christian Science would say there's more. There's more than the limits of that construct. There's more that can't be measured. There's more than what's visible. And yet we all I think would say, for the most of us, love is a thing. Now, I can't measure it, but I do believe it. I more than believe it, I feel it, and I've felt it have an impact on my life. And so it's there. Everybody would say we feel it or know it or believe in its influence in some way. So the Christian Science method is to say, well, I'm going to look deeper in a sense, in that broader way. And I have to use a different set of tools to measure. I have to use things like honesty with myself and humility before what God is, and honesty in my experience to say whether or not I'm really seeing this play out and make a difference or not. Um, and through that method, that Christianly scientific method, I will continue to grow and learn and prove and walk and follow in the footsteps of what Jesus, seemed to demonstrate himself and to teach others to do. And it tends to lead us to a much bigger and a different kind of definition of who we are than something like DNA does. It leads us to a different sense of where health comes from than just the surface appearance does. Within that construct, like I said, there's logic, and we all seem to see it play out, and it's not to ignore it, but it is to say, but if we don't like the final analysis, which says that always within that construct, it's going to be good and evil, ups and downs, good hands, bad hands. If there's a story that's bigger, and this story threaded throughout human history is what we're going for, then we need different tools. We need a different method to measure how we get there and to walk that walk step by step. We're looking for that more reliable sense of health and of what defines us, of our inherent freedom, of the inherent and inevitable goodness of life, that really nothing else even claims is an option at this point. Hopefully that's helpful. I know it's a big conversation, and maybe just a starting point, but yeah. Okay, well, that looks like the end of the questions for now. So thank you for what you submitted. And I'm going to go back here. I'm going to just wrap up by reading you 2 more lines, one from the Bible and one from Science and Health. And then we'll wrap up and sign off. This line is back with St. Paul again, and he writes, "See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation." Well, why is it the acceptable time? Why is now, right now, the time, the day of salvation? Well, because again, God's grace means that it's already here. It's not coming down the road. It's not something we're earning or working our way up to. The world is not careening towards a cliff, but if we can change things, it'll get better. It's now is the day, moment by moment, step by step, to discover and prove more of what already is, the groundedness of a world of our communities, of our families, and of ourselves, as defined more in the light of God's light, in God's goodness and God's love. Each moment is that day, is that moment, because we're built for that. And this last line from Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, Mary Baker Eddy wrote, "It's possible, yea, it's the duty and privilege of every child, man and woman, to follow in some degree the example of the Master, by the demonstration of truth and life, of health and holiness." So why is it possible? Well, because of how our Maker is and how our Maker has made us to be. The question of whether we feel worthy or not really isn't a question about us. It's a question about, well, how did your Maker make you? And what is God doing? The prayer that has saved me many times when I feel like I don't know what to do next, or I don't know enough, is, well, thank God it's not about me, a me that is, conceived in this sense apart from what God is and what God is doing. It's like a revelation. It's like a brand new discovery every single time, no matter how many times I feel like I learn a little bit more about that. When we feel swept up and tempted another direction, and we find our way back and it hits us and we rediscover it, it's like, oh, thank you. It feels like grace. It feels like that unearned love of God. It's not because I was doing the right thing or thinking the right thing. It's because the truth came to me. It met me right where I was. And that's what Christ is. It's that true idea of God that meets the human mind right where it is, and whatever it thinks itself to be, whatever it thinks the world is. And it's that power of God that is just sweeping down the centuries, as Mary Baker Eddy wrote, gathering beneath its wings and the sick and the sinning, and healing. That's the promise of this this approach of just our walk with God every day. We are made to discover that truth and that life, and to prove and feel our health and our holiness, and that of our neighbors, that of the world. So thank you so much for taking this time. Thank you for your questions and for praying this stuff through. Thank you for the folks in Rockville who care enough about your community to be really praying about these issues, and to offer what you can to your neighbors and to everybody else. So I hope we're all just feeling that light of God right here and now. It is what's defining, and I want to thank you then for being you, for being the place where that light shines through. You're needed, and your prayers are needed, and your daily walk with God every day, just turning to that and being led, discovering your part and letting that light shine through. It's needed and it matters. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care.